Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Mars Hill Radio, a production of GodsProof.com. And now, here's your host, Jeff Sievertson.
Welcome to Mars Hill. I'm your host, Jeff Sievertson. As you know, the premise of the show is to have a discussion between myself and another person that does not believe as I do with respect to the existence of God and the Bible being a divinely inspired book. But tonight, I'm taking a slight detour, and I've invited a guest on that supports both of these points. In my interview earlier with Beth Perkheiser, I briefly mentioned Bible codes as supporting evidence for the Bible being divinely inspired. I didn't get a chance to go very far in the conversation, and Beth, of course, she didn't agree. So tonight I have called on an expert to give us a more in-depth understanding of what Bible codes are and also what they are not. My guest tonight is R. Edwin Sherman. Mr. Sherman is a nationally known consulting mathematician with 37 years of experience. He is president of the Isaac Newton Bible Code Research Society and director of Bible Code Digest. The Isaac Newton Bible Code Research Society is dedicated to critically examine the odds that various code findings could appear by chance. It is also author of 3 books, Breakthrough, Encountering the Reality of the Bible Codes, Bible Code Bombshell, and Buddha and Jesus, Could Solomon Be the Missing Link? Mr. Sherman received a BA in mathematics with highest honors in 1971 from the University of California at San Diego, and an MA in mathematics with high honors in 1973, also from UCSD. He passed 3 of the 4 qualifying examinations for a PhD in mathematics, including the one for probability and statistics, before deciding to pursue a career as a financial management consultant. Over his career, Ed has served as a consultant to numerous large financial institutions, Fortune 500 companies, and government agencies at all levels. He has served as a senior researcher for a major financial institution for 3 years, as a principal at one of the 3 largest CPA firms for 7 years, and as an independent consultant for 18 years. He has written more than 70 articles in professional and trade publications and delivered numerous speeches to a broad spectrum of audiences. He is frequently called upon as an expert witness in major litigation. So having said all of that, Mr. Sherman, are you with us today?
Yes, I am. Good afternoon or good evening, whatever it is.
Yeah, whichever it is. Thanks again for coming on the program. In my years of taking a critical look at the Bible, I enjoyed finding researchers like yourself that started off as skeptics but then later moved towards believing whatever they were searching for or examining. And I think this gives you some objectivity with respect to research. So if you could, tell us about your journey in starting off as a skeptic with respect to the codes and then moving towards believing it was a valid phenomenon.
Well, back in 1996, 7, something like that, Michael Drosnin put out a book called The Bible Code, which I read. It was a New York Times bestseller for a while. And I was extremely skeptical about it when I read it, but I was intrigued with the challenge of trying to estimate the probability that some of the findings in his book could happen by chance. And so I worked on that for a while and developed the mathematics, the formulas to estimate those probabilities, and assessed the findings that he had in his book, and I concluded that almost all of them could easily be due to chance. Uh-huh. And so I thought this was something that it was almost laughable in a way, and he was just making suckers of a lot of people. Mm-hmm. But then there were a couple of clusters in his book that I thought were fairly unusual or improbable. And in fact, I did some calculations on those, and they came out like 1 in 10,000 or something like that. They were unusual. And in looking at how to calculate the odds of chance occurrence of these, what I came to a conclusion was that one would never really know whether there was anything there or not unless you took the initial findings like Drosnin had set forth and had examined each of those code findings to see if they were part of a longer code. In other words, if you just look for a single word as a code within the Bible, and it's a fairly short word in Hebrew letters, the odds are very high that you'll find it. And the reason for that is that there are millions, if not billions, of opportunities to find what you're looking for. However, once you find a particular word as an equidistant letter sequence, if you then say it as a skip of 10 or 20 or something like that, you can then take the Hebrew text and try to see what, if this code were part of a phrase or a sentence or a multi-sentence code, and have a Hebrew expert examine the string of letters before and after it to see if it is part of something that's much longer and therefore more significant. So that was back 1998, 99, and I first had determined that what I really needed was an expert in Hebrew, and so I looked around, and in my own hometown of just 20,000, I found a Hebrew expert who had been educated in Israel and had from elementary school through PhD, and befriended him, and we started working together. He, by the way, is a Jew, an agnostic Jew. He doesn't. He's kind of like Tevye in Fiddler on the Roof. He'll say, "Well, maybe this, maybe that," but he just doesn't want to commit to any particular position. That's his disposition.
So he's not necessarily biased towards the Bible being divinely inspired. He's kind of takes a neutral position.
Well, if anything, he's biased against that.
Well, yeah, that'd be true, I guess.
But he's willing to, as a scientist, as a physicist, he's open to objectively looking at these things, and he loves translating things from Hebrew into English and this kind of thing. And so we worked together for approximately 10 years. And on our website, BibleCodeDigest.com, we have about 100 articles of our findings in researching different topics and the extended codes that we found. Now, notice I said extended codes. That means not just the initial findings like what Drosnin had, but finding something that's quite lengthy and therefore significant, because length really does correlate very strongly with significance.
Yeah.
Let me give you an example. Suppose you look for Jesus as a code in Isaiah 53, which is regarded as probably the most pertinent prophecy about Jesus in the Old Testament. And you find Yeshua, or Hebrew for Jesus, as a code. And in fact, it is there with a skip of 20 between each letter. So you start with the first letter of Jesus and skip 20 letters, pick up another letter after 20 letters, and so forth, and you find Yeshua. Well, Yeshua exists as an ELS about 600,000 times in the Old Testament because it's fairly short and it has common letters. So just finding that is, you might, it's a yawner. It's something that it means nothing. However, in this particular case, we looked at the letters before and after it. And what we found was a lengthy code that transversed the entire chapter 53 of Isaiah and was a multi-sentence and has about 10 parallels to the content in the gospel accounts of the Mount of Transfiguration.
Yeah.
So you start with Jesus, and then what you find right after it says, "Jesus is my mighty name, and the clouds rejoiced." Before it says, gushing from above, "Jesus is my mighty name, and my clouds rejoiced." Where at the mountain said Levi, "Their light came, God is in it." So here you have this multi-sentence code in very good Hebrew that goes right through this biblical prophecy. Now, the odds of that happening are pretty darn small. I haven't calculated it recently, but it's, let's say it's 1 in a million of getting something that lengthy in excellent Hebrew that is very pertinent to the text itself and makes a great deal of sense. Now, suppose that's all we had found, I would still say I'm a skeptic about Bible codes. Yeah. However, we've been doing 10 years of research on this, and as I say, we have 100 articles covering our research on different code findings in different books of the Bible on different topics.
Yeah. And this particular...
That's when I... Yeah,
I'm sorry. The particular code you're talking about in Isaiah 53, that's the one you wrote about in your book, Bible Code Bombshell?
Yes.
Yeah. I just wanted to let the listeners know that they can look at that in more detail, because I think half the book you had where you talked about the code and what it meant, and then or at least in the appendix you had, for anybody who's technically minded who wants to actually understand how you did the probability, that you did include that in the book as well, correct?
Yes, that's correct. There's a technical appendix where I derive some formula for that kind of thing.
Okay, I just wanted to let the guests know that they can actually go look at that in more depth if they wanted to in your book.
Yeah. Yes.
So I'm sorry. Go ahead.
So one of the problems with the whole history of this thing, as far as its reputation, is that the people who've been skeptical about it immediately seize upon the first step of the process and criticize it as if it were the only step in the process.
Yeah.
And really, it's just the beginning, because you find an initial short word. You can do that in a Jerusalem phone book or just about any collection of Hebrew letters. But finding lengthy, coherent messages that actually topically relate to what the surface text of the Hebrew Bible is talking about, that's really unlikely to happen unless it was intentionally put in there by the author.
Yeah. And I know that one of the criticisms I had heard before was Hebrew allows for a great deal of wordplay because it's all consonants and no vowels. For a critic that says that, what do you have to say about that with respect to the Hebrew?
Well, I agree with him. But here's, let me draw an analogy. Well, let's say this: you find a particular word as an equidistant letter sequence where the skip between the letters is equal. Mm-hmm. Say every 20 letters, every 5, every 30, whatever, something like that. Well, let's see. I lost my train of thought.
Yeah. I'm starting to do that myself as I get older.
Yeah. Well, I'm 63 now, so it happens more often. It's unfortunate, but okay. I'm trying to think what I'm like. Okay. I think I'm back on track now. I have on the Bible Code Digest website a link that is called, I think, Scientific Research Papers. Uh-huh. And that summarize about 10 years of research. And in that, we come up with estimates of what the probability is of finding an extension to a particular initial word by chance, of finding something that's in halfway decent Hebrew. And that probability is about 25%. So what I'm saying is it's not at all unusual to find something, and it's for the reason you cited, that without the vowels and it just being consonants, it's not that hard to find something. Mm-hmm. However, the kinds of findings that we have are like we're looking at a probability of finding an extension that is like 38, 40%, something like that, on a fairly consistent basis. And if it's just a chance thing, think of it like Major League Baseball. You've got the league average, batting average is 25%. Mm-hmm. Well, that's about the chance of finding something, if you look for it as an extension to an existing code. It's about the same as the batting average of somebody in the major leagues. Well, what we've been seeing in what we have researched is a batting average that's pretty consistently at least 35%, if not 37 to 40%. So it's kind of like saying that so-and-so, whoever is the leader in the National League in batting average, that's just purely a coincidence. He's really just an average player, and he just happened to get lucky and hit a lot more hits. when we all know that's not true. The reason that the person is at the top in terms of batting average is because they are darn good. And that's really the kind of thing that we find here, is this differentiation between the probability of finding extensions that you get from the Bible on a particular topic and what you would get from alternative text. So it's a little bit subtle, but it's been a very consistent phenomenon that we've seen in 10 years of research.
And since you brought up what you find in other books, what are some of the findings that you have in other books that are, outside of the Bible, and how do they stack up to the Bible itself?
Well, what we have looked at, for example, is a Hebrew translation of Tolstoy's novel War and Peace.
Uh-huh.
And you can find stuff that's in acceptable Hebrew, although it's not very terribly long. There are some extensions. But you end up with words or strings of words that will make you scratch your head and say, what in the world is that about? If it's kind of random.
Uh-huh.
So you can have something that's in good Hebrew, but it doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
Yeah.
And in fact, it probably doesn't make any sense. Now, there are, with some degree of occurrence, codes that Dr. Jacoby translated, where what he came up with initially did not seem to make sense, although there are lots of examples of where he found something that appeared to not make much sense, and then later, when an event occurred that was related to that, we saw that, in effect, what the code was talking about was actually fulfilled, in a sense, as a prophecy.
And these are codes out of the Bible?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. We found one, for example, I think in the fall before the invasion of Iraq, that was about Bush and his claiming victory, and it nailed it down to the date that he declared quote-unquote victory in Iraq. And we were very skeptical about this at the time that we found it. In fact, we said, no, it couldn't mean that.
Yeah.
And sure enough, it was the first day of the Hebrew month of ER, which Y-A-R, was the day on which Bush said, we have been victorious in Iraq. Now, we all know that he was optimistic in that assessment, but nevertheless, it was a historical event, and the code talks specifically about that. Now, one of the problems with, there are several problems. If the codes have validity, and a lot of them are about current or potential future events, then you can ask the question, can you use them to make prophecies? And my answer is no. And why is that? It's because, there are really several reasons. What we have in the codes are what I would call prophetic fragments. You don't know who is speaking. It doesn't identify. It doesn't have quotation marks or punctuations. And the speaker may or may not be speaking the truth. It's only their opinion.
Yeah.
But typically these fragments are recognized or well-known opinions and points of view. So you have that kind of thing going on. You have the possibility that there could be parts of it that are coincidental, or there may be multiple interpretations or translations possible, so on and so forth. So it's very hazardous, and I would strongly recommend against trying to use this to predict the future. Well, if that's the case, then you might say, well, what's this all about? Why are there codes in the Bible if you accept the notion that they are? My theory is that they're there for the purpose of authenticating the text as having a divine source. And it's kind of like if you hold a $20 bill up to the light and it says US 20, US 20, US 20, there's this little authentication strip in there that counterfeiters can't duplicate. And codes are kind of that kind of thing, because they they underscore and sort of echo the topics of what the literal text is talking about. And yet you can't really rely on them because separately. And I think that's appropriate because suppose that you could rely on these codes for predictions. Then you've got a situation where all of a sudden some crazy researchers like myself and Dr. Jacoby become more important than the authors of the Bible itself.
Yeah.
And that's crazy. That's just totally crazy. And it's a nonsensical type of thing. So the real purpose is, I think, authentication.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that I've not only have I, when talking to people that are not Christian or not believers, and trying to help them understand what the codes are for, I also run into the problem when talking to Christians that when I talk about the codes or what they mean, they'll oftentimes, I get accused of, well, Jeff, you're not supposed to be looking for other truth, or if God wanted us to know something else, he would have made it plain and simple. He would not have encoded it. And I've tried to do the best I could to explain that, well, the codes are not really there to show new truth or something separate from what is on the surface. It's there to authenticate that the document itself was, that the Word of God was divinely inspired. And would you'd agree with that, correct?
Yes, definitely.
Okay.
Because we have lots of codes that are from a specific point of view, and these points of view clash.
Yeah.
We have things from a terrorist point of view, or an American point of view, or Islamic, or Buddhist, or whatever, on and on and on.
Yeah.
But typically what we're finding in the codes is that what is expressed is at least a well-known point of view or opinion of someone. And they're usually fairly recognizable.
Yeah, it reminded me of this issue of perspective and how you can, if you're not careful, you can take something out of context. One time I was out buying a card for somebody, and I saw this little card. It was a birthday card, and it had a little girl on the front of it, and she was holding the gift, and there was a scripture underneath. It said, they gave gifts one to another. And I looked at the scripture, and I thought, well, that doesn't seem to fit, and I went and looked it up. It was over in Revelation, and the context of it is people were giving gifts one to another because they had just killed the two prophets of God. And I thought, well, that's kind of a creepy card to give somebody. That's not really the essence of what the card was supposed. It's not, giving a gift out of joy or anything. These were giving gifts out of exhilaration that they just killed two prophets of God. So if you're not careful, I think that what's the phrase that I heard in college, a proof text taken out of context is pretext. Yeah. And I think that's what, with respect to the codes, is that, like you said, the point of view is uncertain, or it is certain, and it doesn't have anything to relate to what God may prescribe or declare.
That's correct.
Okay. What are some of the biggest skepticisms that you hear all of the time, and how do you answer those skepticisms, other than what we've talked about now?
The main one I think we've already covered. They'll say, and usually the critics will just camp on these single word code findings, or some researcher will come up with a matrix which will have 4 or 5 single words in it, and because you can put them in a diagram and they appear close, they'll say, they're related and they're significant. Well, each one of those short little codes is extremely likely to be just coincidental. You found it because you were looking for it, and because there were billions of opportunities to find it. So they just attack that, and appropriately so, because it is bogus, and they'll never talk about the sort of findings that we have on our website. Now, there are a couple of exceptions where people have attacked our website, and what they have said was, Dr. Jacoby say Hebrew is bad. As I said, I get back to them and say, well, let's compare his credentials in Hebrew with yours. And they usually run off in the other direction at that point because they typically have almost no experience other than maybe at most a couple of Hebrew classes. Whereas here's somebody who started from age 6 in the Israeli schools, went through a PhD, lived there for some years, came to the States with a physicist at Jet Propulsion Lab, was teaching Hebrew frequently during that period of time. 8 years ago, he went back to Israel, is now living with his son and daughter in Israel, and is speaking Hebrew all the time. And in fact, he and his wife constantly speak Hebrew to one another in preference over English because they both know Hebrew in effect better than English. And so, but they'll still come up with, they'll understand the probability argument, but they'll say, well, we don't think his Hebrew is good. The other problem with that kind of thing is it's like somebody who knows 1,000 Hebrew words is looking at the translation of somebody who has a Hebrew vocabulary of 100,000 words. And they'll say, well, there's some stuff in there that he's using words that don't exist. Well, I think it's more like he's using words that he knows that they don't know because he has a much greater vocabulary.
Yeah. Well,
we have also worked with a second Hebrew expert who pretty much stands behind and validates the accuracy and appropriateness of Dr. Jacoby's Hebrew translations. And for him, Hebrew is also his first language.
Is this Moshe Aaron Shank? Or Shake?
Shak.
Shak, I'm sorry.
Shak, yeah.
Moshe Shak, okay.
Yeah,
because I saw him listed on your website. Okay, so you have a couple of different Hebrew experts validating the Hebrew part. Do you submit your mathematical work or your equations to other folks to examine and look at?
Yes, I had a PhD in mathematics review my equations and endorse them, yes.
That's one of the things I had found on your website when you discussed that you had several doctors or PhDs also look at your equations and confirm that, that your work was valid.
Yes.
And one of the things I had, and as I was doing my own research and looking, you were actually one of the few that seemed to take a very critical and objective view. Is there anybody else out there that you know of that's doing the level of work that you're doing with the codes?
I don't think so.
Yeah, because that's one of the things I had come across when I started to, because I was skeptical at first myself when I saw this, and I kind of peered out and was looking through other websites, and like we talked about what some of the skeptics had spoken about, they were hitting at the early process of looking for the code or some of the more trivial codes. I think they attacked people like Chuck Missler and Grant Jeffries and Yaakov Ramsel was another person I had come across.
And unfortunately, their codes are short.
Yeah.
Generally.
And I think Yaakov Ramsel, he actually searched just for the name Yeshua by hand. At least in his book, that's what he talked about. Yes.
Well, that's a tough way to do it, by hand.
Yeah.
Especially if you have big skips. Well, it's easy when you got a computer program, but you can do it by hand, but you better make sure you're counting all the letters accurately.
Yeah. One other person that I did find who was a Christian who was skeptical about the codes was Michael Heiser. I don't know if you've ever heard of him.
Oh, yes.
Okay. He, and what I read through his information, he was mostly focusing on the issue that there are variations within the Hebrew texts that are extant, and that does make, at first it made sense, like, well, yeah, there are variations, so if you have even one yod or tittle missing, then that would throw off this whole idea of a code. So what is your answer to that kind of response? Is that, well, we have so many variations of the text of the Hebrew, so how is it that you can find one text that's perfectly encoded?
Well, I think the fact that there are letter differences is another reason why you should not use any purported codes for predictions. Because, for one, we don't know whether this is, the best or the closest thing to encoded text or not. So it has a lot to do with that. If you delete or insert letters, it really has a major impact on what you find. What is intriguing is that that code I talked about in Isaiah 53 about Jesus, originally it was 24 letters long. And some skeptics pointed out that right in the middle of that text there is a difference of one letter between some of the different versions. So we said, well, let's take a look at whether the extension is longer or shorter if you take that alternative version. And that's when we found an alternative translation for it that was 40 letters long than 22 letters long. So it actually, using a different version, actually lengthened the thing. Now, of course, it could go the other way. But I would say that these letter differences underscore the difficulties of trying to place too much reliance on the content of any one specific code.
Oh, okay.
But there are different questions here. One is, are we looking at a situation where we're trying to have a precise message to a code, or are we trying to answer the question, is this phenomenon real or is it illusory? And if you are looking at the latter question, it's really more one of looking at the kinds of batting averages that you come up with, of finding extensions among the codes that you have found in a particular text on a particular topic. A little bit up or down. But what is totally striking is that the batting averages are way at the top or beyond the best major league hitters' batting averages, whereas they should be down with the league average of 25%. We're in the high 30s. And just consistently runs that way through all sorts of probably at least 50 major studies that we've done.
And that's
it's very striking.
And that's what keeps bringing you back to the codes are really just there to validate the document is divinely inspired.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, there are some very striking singular phenomena that are extremely unlikely. For example, the longest code ever found, the one by Moshe Shak, is 296 letters long. It's on the Bible Code Digest website homepage. If you go to, I think, the top 10 codes, it lists it. And this particular 296 letter long code breaks down into a description of the political career of Shimon Peres, who is still in the cabinet of the Israeli government, and has had probably a 30, 40-year long history as a Israeli politician. That's 296 letters long. Now, there's no way that you're going to find stuff in good Hebrew that's going to continue on for that long a period, coincidentally, and be relatable to a known phenomenon.
Yeah.
There's another, the second longest code, and the third longest one one is 187 letters long, the other is 139 letters long, and they're about Mel Gibson. And the intriguing thing about this is Moshe Shak is an Orthodox Jew, and so when he presented these translations to us, he was coming from the perspective of an Orthodox Jew and was extremely critical of Mel Gibson and his book, his film, the Passion of the Christ. And so the Code paints a pretty negative picture of Mel Gibson. I was troubled by that and questioned it extensively because it does say things like Mel is rotten and he's got issues and problems and so on and so forth.
Uh-huh.
Well, lo and behold, since in the aftermath of the movie, we've seen some definite instances where Mel's got problems.
Yeah, he does.
Like I say, I resisted Moshe on this because I thought he was just being, prejudicial.
Yeah.
And yet, what he found in those contents is kind of been borne out that, like I say, Mel has some serious issues. And
that's interesting.
those particular codes even talk about some of that. So that one kind of blew me away.
So, like, for the one code that was 296 letters long, if you were to calculate out the probability of that happening, I know it's, extremely high, but what would it come to?
The probability of that happening by chance is awfully close to zero. 1 in trillions times trillions times trillions, something like that.
Yeah.
You just aren't going to find something that long. I did do one set of calculations trying to estimate if there weren't codes in the Bible and, given the probability of extensions, what's the longest code that would be possible to find from that are random,
uh-huh.
and came up with something around 100 letters. But we're at 300.
Yeah, you're well over that.
Well over that, yeah. And the point is, it's not just random words. In this particular case, they're descriptive phrases about the political career of Shimon Peres.
Yeah. So
it's not noise. It's stuff that makes a lot of sense. And then the stuff about Mel Gibson, same thing. And then the next longest code after that, and this one really blew me away, is a Buddhist code, or a code about Buddha and Buddhism and the difficulties that Buddhists experience in trying to spread their religion outside of Tibet and Asia to Western cultures.
Yeah.
And I presented this translation to a woman I know who is a Buddhist, and she read it, and she fell off her chair because she said, "This makes total sense to me." The content of that 108-letter long code, because it had some symbolic language and so forth. It was exactly talking about that phenomenon of just sort of the cultural difficulties of Westerners understanding Tibetan Buddhism.
Yeah, and your book had a quote, either your book or your website, Jesus or Buddha and Jesus. It had the Dalai Lama had made mention that the difficulty of a Westerner trying to take up Buddhist practices where he ends up feeling homeless inside himself.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, that is interesting.
Yeah, and I mean, it's really surprising that the Dalai Lama actually said that. And yet the reason he said it is he's all too aware of lots of instances of Westerners who've gone into Buddhism really gung-ho and come out pretty messed up.
Yeah.
And it's not surprising when you stop and think of it, because if you take it totally seriously and you go off and you meditate for 3 months without end and deprive yourself of food and communication with other people, guess what? You're going to be very depressed. And that's not a surprising thing. And he's aware of thousands of instances like this where people have then gone through this intense shift and then really needed a lot of very serious counseling to cope with life again.
I know I'm shifting my question away from the codes, but I liked your book in Buddha and Jesus where Solomon, you make this connection where Solomon actually could be that connection, because Solomon existed at least 400 years or more before Buddha had, gone underneath the Bodhi tree and then became enlightened. And a lot of the things that he stated parallel a lot of things that Solomon had stated.
Yes.
And I've heard from Buddhists that they'll say that, well, Jesus was influenced by Buddha, but you make this strong connection to show that, well, Buddha was probably influenced by Solomon.
Yes, and of course we know that Jesus was influenced by Solomon because Jesus was a Jew. And of course, Jesus made comments about Solomon. He obviously knew a great deal about him.
Yeah.
As a central figure in Judaism. But the Bible itself plainly says that the whole world sought the wisdom of Solomon.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of evidence to show that the people in Israel at that time were well aware of India's existence.
Yeah. And then the connection you made where they were showing certain animals that were given to Solomon that were indigenous only to that region of India.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So
Peacocks and Indian elephants.
Yeah.
That are specifically mentioned in the biblical text. But, going back to, and this is on codes again, the Buddhist code, that one that's 108 letters long, the one thing that really blew us away is that 108 is the most important sacred number in Buddhism and Hinduism.
Oh.
And so here we find this 108 letter long code, and 108 is this extremely important number in Buddhism and Hinduism.
I didn't know that.
And in fact, like the Catholics have rosary beads, well, Buddhists and Hindus have malas that are strings of 108 beads. And so when they meditate on something, they count every time they repeat a mantra, they move a mala bead, and until they go through a whole cycle of 108 repetitions of of the mantra that they're meditating upon.
Yeah. Well,
the code was 108 letters long. It's like, well, okay, I guess that could be a coincidence, but
yeah,
who knows?
Well, clearly it says the Lord knows he can declare the end from the beginning, so I'm sure he knew that there would come a time where somebody who would declare himself to be awake or enlightened would propagate these beliefs, and there it is.
There it is.
And something I wanted to point it out, on your website, you have the top 10 myths of Bible codes. And since we're talking about the length of codes, the number 9 myth you have it says the myth, all Bible codes are likely to appear in a non-encoded Hebrew text. And you put here, the truth, the longer a code is, the less likely it is that it could appear by chance. If a code is 6 or few letters long, it is almost certain that one could find it in any Hebrew text. However, if a code is 12 or more letters long, it is very unlikely to be due to chance, and Bible Code Digest presents dozens of codes that are 30-plus letters long, and each one is highly improbable. And I wanted to point that out because, like we said, what a lot of the critics are probably saying is that, well, we can find these codes anywhere, and yes, as you point out, yes, you can, but when you reach at least 30-plus letters long or more, then you go beyond chance. You go beyond chance, and it's just something that's highly improbable. So,
yes.
So that's kind of neat. You said with the 296, 187, 139, 108 links long. Those are pretty spectacular, and you keep finding them all the time, correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, it's not that unusual, and on our website, gosh, I don't know how many codes we've found that are over 30 letters long. I would say at least 50, if not 100, something like that.
Uh-huh.
Which is, for the amount of searching we have done, that amount is relatively small, and to have found that much material with that little searching is mind-blowing.
Yeah. Now, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, we talked about, what some of the skeptics, non-Christians have said. What are some of the objections that you've heard Christians say towards Bible codes?
Well, a lot of the concern comes from this issue that you're somehow elevating the content of the codes to prophecy and looking to them as having more potential validity and importance than the literal text itself. And that's a concern that's there, but at least our position is that there are so many uncertainties about the validity of the content of any one particular code that we really should properly view the reliability as being much, much less than that of the literal text.
Yeah.
Codes are clearly inferior to the literal text.
Yeah.
In terms of the reliability.
And how widely received is, I mean, have you been invited to speak in a number of churches, missions, or anything like that, or?
I've spoken in a number of churches, yes. But the thing that's interesting is over the last 11 years, we have had 5 million visitors to BibleCodeDigest.com, to the website.
Uh-huh.
That's a fairly healthy number.
Yeah.
And we're continuing. The level of interest is still quite strong.
Yeah. Well, that's like I said even before we began our show, is that I just really appreciated the position you took in the position. You started out as a skeptic, taking a position to basically discount them, and then you, through the process of discovery and research, you actually came out the other side. And I appreciate researchers like that. Another person that reminds me like that was Josh McDowell. He used to, I don't know if he still does today, but he worked with Campus Crusade for Christ. And he was, when he was a young man, he was an atheist. And he was challenged to prove that the resurrection did not happen. And so he was actually given a grant by the university that he was with, or he spoke with a professor, and the professor helped him to get a grant, and he went traveling around. And he went out to disprove, to basically show that the resurrection never happened. And it was in some dusty old library where he came to that conclusion that the resurrection happened. He said it wasn't at that time that he received Christ, but he came to the conclusion that this event took place. It was an historical fact. And so I appreciate folks like yourself and Josh McDowell and others that started off in one position and was taking a very critical look, but then moved to the other position just because of the evidence.
Well, let me tell you the first time that I started to turn around. In Drosden's book, he presents this little cluster about Hitler. And one of the codes he had in there is actually a multi-code one. It says enemy and Nazi. Well, we looked at that for an extension, didn't find anything. But then we turned it around the other way. Rather than enemy and Nazi, we looked for Nazi and enemy. And what we found after it was a very powerful phrase. It said, enemy and Nazi, horrible shower. And I just thought immediately of Schindler's List, where they were telling all of these Jews that they were going to go take a shower. And so they removed their clothes as they processed into the gas chamber to be gassed to death. And I just about hit the floor when I saw that. Because, well, maybe there is something to this. And we do need to start looking for possible extensions to some of these codes and just see what we find.
Yeah,
that was kind of the beginning of when I started to say my skepticism was challenged.
Yeah. Well, like I said, I definitely appreciate the work that you have done. It made a huge impact in my life because growing up in I guess we call it a secular society, one of the things when talking to atheists, one of the things that they will oftentimes say is that anything that, with respect to the Bible, it's subjective. You know, you can say this event happened, that event happened, but when it comes to science, we can do things that are testable and repeatable. And there's nothing in the Bible that you can submit to a scientific review that is testable and repeatable. And when I finally came across the codes, and at first being skeptical, and then of course stumbling upon your research, it hit me that this is something that is actually testable and repeatable, because you can take your results, or anybody can take your results, and if they have a knowledge or understanding, or find somebody who knows mathematics and statistics and probability, and find somebody who knows Hebrew, they can repeat these results over and over again.
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, so that's, and I don't know if you coined the term, but somebody said it's an empirical miracle.
No, I haven't coined that one. But
oh, okay.
Interesting.
I ran across that from somewhere, but well, anyway, we're coming up close to our hour. We've got a few minutes left. Is there anything else you would like to let our audience know about the research you're doing? Anybody who's skeptical about the work you're doing? Anything you want to add or say to the guests or to the audience? Well,
I just would encourage listeners to spend some time on the BibleCodeDigest.com website. As I say, there's about 100 articles there, and there are lots of different subtopics and different takes on this. One in particular I'm thinking of is one that talks about points of view, and in that article we have we've kind of subjectively ranked different codes based on a particular point of view. For example, we have a top 10 that express a Jewish point of view, a top 10 for a Christian point of view, and Catholic, and Buddhist, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Like one of them says, Buddha converts me pleasantly, my basis is soft religion, which is interesting.
Yeah.
And then there's another one that struck me. It says, Siddhartha has declined Jesus' hand, and in them they identified a crisis. I was just saying, yeah, there are tensions between Buddhism and Christianity. So there are lots of nuggets like this. Some with an Islamic point of view, American, terrorist, Republican, Democrat. It's an interesting collection.
And I don't know if you said this earlier in the show or not, but it does prove your point that it's almost in a sense that God is not letting any one group proclaim that it belongs to them. It because it gives so many different points of view that the best you can come to is that it's just authenticating it's a divine document.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, the Bible, the literal text itself includes lots of situations where different points of view or opinions are expressed. It's just that when you're in the literal text, you have quotation marks and the source is identified. The problem with codes is you don't have quotation marks there, and whoever is speaking is not identified.
Yeah.
I remember back in 2008, we were looking for Barack Obama codes, and there's one that says, his name is hot. He is there for him and for me, Barack Obama. And then it says, being the thunder of the day from his height, Barack Obama enjoys challenging. And this was back when he was challenging Hillary Clinton. And then there are ones about, number one on the Republican one, I had that one that came out as a prophecy. Mm-hmm. What it said was, you will crush the guilty Saddam, and the month of ER will be restful. Well, the month of ER in 2003 started on May 3rd, and that was the date that Bush declared victory in Iraq. Prematurely, as it turned out, but it says, you will crush the guilty Saddam, and the month of ER will be restful. And then it says, the third Republican point of view, Jay McCain's prison has elevated him. Well, we all know that, McCain came to be known because of his 5 years as a prisoner of war.
Yeah.
And, there's just all sorts of things like this that sometimes they didn't make sense until the events actually occurred. But afterwards, they made a lot of sense.
Yeah. That's very, that's I don't know if you said this, but one Bible code researcher I came across was saying it's not, to try to look at the codes and predict the future, it's a form of divination, and that's not what the codes are there for.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, divination is prohibited.
Yeah.
In the Old Testament. I mean, it's specifically spoken against.
Yeah. And so that's not what the codes are for. So.
And, the interesting thing is, like with Moshe Shak, he's done a lot of research recently on codes about the different Republican candidates, and he, has come up with lots of stuff about Romney. And I comment to him, I say, well, the problem I have with your sense of your certainty about some of these is that it could just be the point of view of somebody who's supportive of Mitt Romney. So when it's talking about him in some favorable light, it's expressing that. So again, it's an issue that it's point of view, and you can't really use it to say, okay, Romney's going to be president. It's expressing that as a hope or a wish, possibly, of somebody who's a Romney supporter.
Yeah.
So we have our little differences of opinion. Of course, Moshe being an Orthodox Jew and myself being a Christian.
Yeah. Well, that is neat, though, that you guys can work together and continue to do the research. And once again, I really appreciate you coming on the show. And just to let our listeners know that to find out more, they can go to BibleCodeDigest.com. And I'm going to put links up on the show and on the visuals on the video for this show, and I'll also post it up on the website. And they can also pick up your book, Bible Code Bombshell. You can get it from your site or from Amazon, and it's a really great read. Of course, I'll admit I didn't understand the appendices because I'm not a mathematician. At my place of work, we're doing project work, and we're using Six Sigma methodology, which has statistics, and I have to go find a statistician and take him out to lunch just to help me with that part. So, but thanks again for coming on, and I really appreciate it, and I just want to thank our audience for listening, and join us next time. Thanks, Mr. Sherman.
Very good, Jeff. Thank you for having me.
Okay, goodbye.
Bye.
He said